Good morning, all. We are at the top of the hour, so I will honor your time. Thank you for being here on time. I will mention at the front end that we are recording this. So if you don't want your picture seen, go ahead and stop the video. But I would also note that there are several of you that have your videos stopped already, and there is nothing harder than giving a workshop and not being able to see the body language and responses of the people that you're talking to. I actually did a strategic planning workshop not too long ago, and 6 out of the 7 people blocked their video and were not real responsive. So it was really difficult for me to sense where things were going. So if possible, if you could engage your video, I would appreciate that. Let's see, chat box. I just put in the chat box a link, and Tammy will be referring to material on that link during the workshop. So you may want to copy that, paste it somewhere else, and that would be great. During the workshop, if you have any questions, if you can throw them in the chat box, since there are so many people on the workshop, I will consolidate those and then interrupt Tammy periodically and say, hey, Tammy, we've got a few questions, and we'll answer those questions. With all of the admin stuff taken care of, let me first off introduce Tammy. And thank you, Tammy, for joining us. Tammy is a partner with Faw Casson, which is a regional CPA firm with offices in Dover and Rehoboth Beach in Ocean City, Maryland. She's the Director of Entrepreneurial Services and has over 26 years of experience in accounting. So a lot of depth, a lot of experience, and Tammy, we appreciate your partnership and sharing your knowledge today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and begin.
All right, well, thank you again. And one of the reasons why I am your presenter today is that nonprofits are one of the segments that our firm specializes in. We do a lot of record organization for nonprofits, and nonprofits have unique challenges in that you rely heavily on usually a small staff and several volunteers. So because of that, you need a steady, and hopefully I can be that steady for you today, and in the future. Please feel free to reach out to me too on an individual basis if you have some more detailed questions, specifically if you need some help with the calculations, because on one end, this seems to be extremely simple, and it can be for a lot of companies. And then we have the other extreme that if you don't meet qualifications, it can get a little complicated. And in true form, usually there's ands, ifs, and buts that you have to interpret, which I'm sure all of you are very familiar with. So as Paul said, please go ahead and send a chat in. He'll be monitoring that and interrupting so we can address those questions. I have no problem with being interrupted. I'm totally okay with that. I'd like for this to be interactive. So if you do want to speak, I see you all are muted. That's great. We've all got our Zoom etiquette already. we're used to these Zoom meetings, right? If you do want to speak, then go ahead and just take your mute off, and then when you're done, just remute yourself. So right now I'm going to dive into it. Here's kind of what I'm going to take you through. I'm going to take you through some stats that are on that link that Paul put in the chat screen. There is so much information in this one link of Treasury alone. It not only has some great background information on the PPP if you're interested, and it also has the application and the instructions. So I'm going to take you through some history of PPP. I'm going to take you through some key terminology and what it really means and some changes. I've been doing this now for 30 years, and I've gone through a lot of tax law changes, but I have to tell you, this PPP has probably changed the most compared to anything else I've ever had to deal with. And not only has it changed the most, but it's changed rapidly, and it has so much confusing points in it. So those of you that have already tried to dive into this, raise your hand if you're already kind of confused by what's going on. Yeah, right? I mean, it's just the language. About the time you think you understand it, then you flip the page and you read something else that just says it contradicted itself. And you're not alone. Don't feel like something's wrong with you if you can't understand this, because again, I've been reading this kind of data for 30 years and there's days that I'm confused too. I can tell you that the financial institutions, I've talked to some of the largest lenders, they are not rushing to give us this forgiveness link. And the reason why they're not is because we got the application, but one thing we didn't get along with it were FAQs. And those FAQs give us so much interpretation that goes behind, those confusing terminology. And we haven't received that yet. So the lenders are a little concerned about rushing and giving us a link that they said they were probably going to give us on June 30th. They pulled back and said, whoa, we're not sure yet. And they're right. There's really no incentive to rush this because we now have a 24 expanded cover period. And I was so relieved when they came up with that, because we were going to have this super condensed 8 weeks. And we didn't know if everybody was going to be able to even spend that money in the 8 weeks, because a lot of us are still limited operations. We haven't brought everybody back. So this 24-week expansion, of course, ending December 31st. So if you're just now getting your loan, you're going to be cheated a little bit of the 24 weeks. But this expanded cover period really gives us all some relief. We could take a breather, step back, make sure we collect the right data to assure that we get 100% forgiveness. I'm going to tailor it a little to nonprofits too, because there's a couple key areas that I know you guys are concerned about with called double dipping. So we'll talk about that too, at the end, and what you can do to hopefully avoid that. Again, we have a really nice big period, so there are some strategies. And I know some of these have probably already been shared with the member organization, but it never hurts to revisit these and, hear them again. So let's talk about the program. So PPP stands for Payroll Protection Program. And when it first came out, it was administered actually by the Small Business Administration, because the government didn't need to administer one more program. So they used an arm, the SBA, they used to administer this program. And one of the things we can all celebrate is that it became available to nonprofits. This is huge because nonprofits are usually carved out of these kind of programs. And so that was big for nonprofit involvement. Now, a group of entities that didn't get to participate are 501c6s, and these would be like your Chamber of Commerce, your Rotaries, those kind of civic organizations. They didn't get the benefit of it, but the 501c3s did. So this is really nice. Now, the rules are not different for you, though, just so you understand that, because that's a question I've received from some nonprofits. Are the rules different for us? And they're really, really not. And so that's why the Treasury link is really helpful as far as that goes. So if you do go onto the home.treasury/gov that we supply to you, you're going to see some interesting statistics on the PPP. The average loan size is $107,000. And that represents 86.5% of all the loans were for less than $150,000 as of June 30th. I find that fascinating. Now, I take care of primarily the small business sector at Faw Casson, and small business and nonprofit. So I saw this. This wasn't anything that shocked me, because I think the client loan largest I may have seen was around 200-some thousand, maybe approaching 3. A lot of clients got $75,000 and less. But overall, I thought that was very encouraging, because who do we really want to help with this? We wanted to help nonprofits in the small business sector, because they shockingly support, this PPP supported 51.5 million jobs. Huge. So that was what the program was for, right? It's called Payroll Protection Program. And it actually supported 51.5 million jobs. Well, on the surface, it seemed to have done what it was supposed to do. And this represents as much of 84% of small business employees, 84%. So let's hope if this data, is correct, it really did target and it helped who it was originally supposed to help. So that's good for a program that was rolled out so quickly with, probably what some would argue a lot of flaws, but let's hope it did get to the right sources. Also, the top 4 industries that received the loan was healthcare, professional and technical services. So these would be like lawyers, accountants, consultants, coaching, construction, and manufacturing. So those were the 4 largest sectors that received the loans. And nonprofits accounted for 34,000 loans for a total of $4.6 billion. That's how much revenue went to nonprofits, $4.6 billion. There's still $131 billion remaining, and this program was due to close June 30th, but the president just signed into legislation, I believe it was Saturday. He expanded the application to August 8th. So if any of you have not applied yet and we're waiting, you can still apply. But here's what I have to tell you. There are several lending institutions that have closed the application process. PNC closed it a while ago, and I just talked to someone from M&T, and they're not accepting any new ones. So if unfortunately you have not applied, or if you know maybe a fellow nonprofit that has not applied, there are still lending institutions that will allow you to apply through them, and you do not have to have a relationship. One that I've been referring to has been Shore United Bank. I'm sure there's others out there too. So just in case that is, a problem.
Tammy,
yes.
Danny can help you connect with an organization to get a loan if you have not yet applied.
That'd be great. Yeah, that would be great. All right, so let's go a little bit into the actual PPP foundation of the program. So originally, as I had mentioned, you had 8 weeks to use the funds. And if you guys remember way back when you applied, it was a mathematical calculation. You took wages, you took SUDA if your nonprofit elects to pay state unemployment tax. You could take group health, and you could take retirement match contributions. And that was considered total eligible payroll costs. And so kind of remember that, because when we review the application, you need to remember what those 4 things are in eligible payroll. Used to be that had to be 75% of your spend. Now that has to be only 60%. So that has changed too. So you have to be very careful of the material you're reading, because so much has changed. So it's become a little bit more liberal on the payroll can be a smaller portion. Then the other 40% can be, now you don't have to limit your payroll to 60%, but the other 40% can be non-payroll covered cost, which was basically rent, which a lot of your organizations pay. If your organization does own a building and you had your mortgage before February of 2020, you could take the mortgage interest, not the principal, and it was utilities. And then a few other things called transportation, things like that. Now, I can tell you from what I'm seeing already on helping clients with documentation is that we may not even have to present the non-payroll costs, because the program has been extended to 24 weeks. So think about it now. If your PPP loan was $75,000 and we have to spend at least 60% on payroll, but now we have 24 weeks, that's almost half the year. Chances are most of you are going to spend that hands down in payroll, and you're not even going to need SUDA and retirement and health and the non-payroll like rent and utilities and mortgage interest. You're not even going to need it. So what's nice about that is if you think you want to do some initial calculations and you think you meet that, just go ahead and stop, because don't put yourself and your staff through tracking all these other expenditures when you don't really need to. So we are anticipating that most borrowers will be able to satisfy their requirement through payroll alone. So you do have the 24 weeks, but no matter what, it stops December 31st. So it's 24 weeks or December 31st. Most people are going to fall into that 24 unless you got your loan after July, maybe like 16th is the math, I think. If you get your loan after July 16th, then your 24 is going to expand beyond that, but you're not going to allow to go, to go beyond the December 31st. So whichever occurs first. Also, too, if you received your loan by June 5th, you can elect to do the 8-week covered period. Now, the only time we have seen that a borrower wants to do this is that they really didn't have any interruption in employees. Yes, maybe their business was interrupted, but they had the funds and the resources. You guys have reserves, and you actually kept all of your employees on payroll, and no one's wages dropped, because you do have a 25% factor that you have to make sure that nobody's wages drop by more than 25%. If that is the case, then you just may want to apply when it comes open to be done with it. Now, I attended a CPE on this, and one strategy they said, but again, we don't have a crystal ball, and this is one of these areas, boy, do I wish I did, because their thought was, well, originally we all thought we were going to be dancing in the streets in 2 weeks. You remember that, when we were all like, 2 weeks, this will all be over with. And then I think we quickly realized that 2 weeks was not going to happen. And then we were all kind of talking like, we'll wait till the summer, because how many of us heard that this virus dies in the summer, right? We all heard that. Well, now, and I'm a positive person, but now I'm even worried about Q3 and Q4. What does this mean when you guys thought you were just going to postpone your, March, April, May events, and you thought you were going to have your fundraising events in September and October, and now I'm sure you've already met and you're deciding, wow, do we have to even cancel our Q3 and Q4 events? And how many of you are seeing grant sources that are pulling back? And maybe you do annual campaigns, and donors, are pulling back on their funding. So this is something that we have to look at long term. So the theory I was going back to was saying, should we just go ahead and apply for forgiveness? Because do we think the government's going to come in and do round 2 of PPP? I mean, we still have quite a few billions of dollars left that's not being used. And some people are going to have to maybe pay back part of the PPP, which will just go back into the funds available. And if they're still available, are we going to have round 2? And maybe you can't take advantage of round 2 if you're still open in your round 1. I don't know. Again, I wish I could give you some definite, answers on that, but that is just a theory of when to apply. There are some caps. Many of you may have heard of an $100,000 employee cap. So originally that came out to be a limitation of about $15,385. So here's what this means. You get to your forgiveness period, you can only count $15,385 for an employee that makes over 100. But that was the old 8-week number. So the new 24-week number is $20,833. So somebody who makes over 100 grand, which some nonprofits could easily have a director or CEO that could be over 100 grand, you are going to be capped in your PPP forgiveness. Now, again, I'm not very concerned about that with most people, because you have 24 weeks to absorb. And remember when we talked about our original calculation, we had to divide by 12, multiply by 2.5. So we didn't get the full wage, anyways. Remember, that was for a brief calculation, whereas now we have 24 weeks. That's for almost half a year's salaries. So once you are ready to apply for forgiveness, the lender has 60 days from receipt of your completed application to issue a decision to the SBA. So basically they say, yep, hands down, 100% of your loan qualifies for forgiveness, or no, we have a possibility of a loan. If the borrower, if you don't apply for forgiveness within 10 months from the time that your cover period is ended, then it is automatically considered a loan, and the loans now have a minimum of 5 years. So loan maturity is five years. Now, if you did get your loan on or before 6/5, it was originally 24 months was the original loan. That is up to you and the lender. So you can have that discussion to have it spread out to 5. But it's our job to help everyone try to get 100% forgiveness here. And if it isn't a for sure 100% with your organization, I'm going to briefly go over some strategies that we can possibly use that you can maximize that, because the goal is for you to get 100% forgiveness. Paul, do we have any questions yet before I move on? Okay. So now let's talk about the qualifications for receiving PPP forgiveness. So one of the big ones is to take a head count. So there's head count, which are FTEs, which stand for full-time equivalents. So we have head count that we have to worry about. And then we also have to make sure pay levels have not dropped. So there's 2 qualifications that we have to make sure that we meet. Now, again, when I talk about this, I'm going to basically refer to this 24-week period. And you're also going to hear me say that you have until December 31st to restore both of those conditions. So if you don't meet it now, you have until December 31st to meet both the FTE count and the pay levels. So that's good news. So first, let's talk about a reduction of FTEs, full-time equivalents. So in order to receive full forgiveness, you must have maintained the number of FTEs that you claimed originally on your PPP application. So if you remember going back, your PPP application asked you how many employees you had. So let's just say for simplicity, you have 10. You have 10 employees. So now we have to look at your payroll, and we have to see if you've maintained those 10. Now there are several exemptions, and I'm very happy about these because originally we did not have this level of exemption. And this is going to give almost everyone relief, and I'll give an example of a few. So if you laid off an employee and then you gave them a written offer to return and they rejected, that will not ding you on your FTE count. You still can count 10. You don't even have to report 9 and say I have an exemption. You're going to be at 10. There is new legislation, though, that puts the burden on you to report that to the state unemployment office if you have any employees that have rejected their rehire, and you have to report this within 30 days. And I suspect this is because of the unemployment. And you all heard how everybody's like, well, I can't get my employees to come back because they're making this extra $600 that was subsidized by the federal government. And a lot of employees are getting $1,000 a week. That's a $52,000 salary. And nonprofits, we know, is a labor of love. Your employees don't always make top dollar because they're passionate about the organization. So you get somebody who's making 40 and they're making 52 on unemployment, they may not want to return, but that's okay for you. Then also too, and I'll say this several times because it's so important, if you do ultimately restore them by December 31st, none of this matters. None of this matters at all. In addition, you can apply for an exemption if the employee was fired for cause, if they voluntarily resigned, or if they requested a reduction of payroll hours. So that's important, because if you did have a dip in wages and salaries, remember we were talking about this 25%, if you did have a reduction in what you paid in wages and salaries, but the employee asked for a reduction of hours and you honored it, again, you will not get dinged for that. So this is pretty important. But again, we have until December 31st. So I'm really hoping that Q4, we can do this. We can all these borrowers can restore their employees back to. Just as a show of hands, because I'm really curious, because I ask clients this all the time, and a lot of clients have had a dip, but when I explain the exemptions, then they're okay. So how many of you have experienced a decline in FTEs by raise a hand? Okay. All right. So I see looks like at least half maybe have received decline of FTEs. Have you restored them, or do you think you're going to restore them by December 31st? Show of hands. Okay. I think almost the same hands went up. Okay. This is really good. So this is kind of, interesting, because you say, well, gosh, resignation, these conditions, well, it happens. So I have a medical practice. One of the doctors is leaving, and two of his family members were hired by the practice. Well, they voluntarily resigned, so they're okay. Also, too, you may have had somebody that resigned, so you think, oh, am I going to take a FTE reduction? But then you hired somebody else. No, you don't have to take a ding on the person who resigned, and the person who joined your organization is an FTE count too. So what I'm trying to stress is we just have a lot of flexibility and opportunity to make sure you've met that FTE, count.
Tammy, there's a quick question here. On the application for forgiveness, it says it looks back to February or January for FTEs, not from when you applied. Is that correct?
Yes, that's the quick calculation. So that is the quick, I don't have to do, oops, sorry. My phone's not on do not disturb. That is a good point to bring up. That is the quick calculation. So if you meet that one, you're done. The easy application you can use, and you're going to get 100% forgiveness. Only do we dive into and use the December 31st if we don't meet that date requirement that you mentioned, Paul. So we do have some options here. Now let's talk about, so we talked about FTE. Let's talk about the second reason why you may not get forgiveness, and that's because an employee's pay has a greater than a 25% decrease in salary and wages over the covered period versus the most recent quarter in which they were actively employed. So you have to look at when they were 100% employed, and then you have to look at the reduction within the 24-week. So again, if you restored their pay, so let's say they were up here and they dropped to here, but now they're back up to here within the 24 weeks, you're fine. You're fine. You don't have to disclose that. You're okay. So that might have happened too, in that you said, you know what, we want to keep everyone employed, but instead of paying you for 40 hours, we might have to pay you for 30. I haven't seen that a lot. Raise a hand. Has anybody done that, actually reduced pay? Yeah, I don't think I'm seeing it. Oh, yep, we do have. Okay. And has the pay reduced more than 25%?
So can I ask a question?
Sure.
So the way I read the instructions were that you were to take the average full-time equivalents during the covered period, but you're kind of saying by that 24th week, if we've restored, we don't have to take any reduction at all.
Absolutely.
So it's not the average full-time equivalents.
No, well, I'm sorry. Now, originally we did have to do that, and we had to restore it by the 8th week. Now we've been given 24 weeks to restore it. So the calculation is still the same. Is that what you're asking me? Because the calculation is the same. The period to restore them is longer.
The way I read the instructions it was the average full-time equivalents during your covered period, whether you choose 8 or 24, and you're to compare that to the full-time equivalents that you had when you applied or during the comparative period.
Sure. Yes.
So
Or
what you're
during the-
saying is not that. What you're saying is if you've restored your full-time equivalent, let's say by the 24th week, it doesn't matter that you dip down.
Oh, right. Yeah. It doesn't matter that you dip down. Absolutely not. As long as you restored it by the earliest of December 31st or your 24 covered week. And this is the area that's been in most conflict. And one thing that does concern us is we have not received an FAQ on that. Because think about it. Let's say you go through this whole period and your FTE is dropped, right? And then all of a sudden, magically on one day, like December 31st, I can say, oop, everybody's back. I'm paying you. That we have not received any guidance on. So we're just going based on interpretation now of the earlier of December 31st or the end of your covered period, which has now been expanded.
Can I ask a clarifying question, follow up?
Sure.
So is it the average or is it the total number of FTEs at the end of the cover period?
This is supposed to be the average. So you're supposed to do, there's a subsequent schedule to Schedule A that you list every single employee and you do their individual calculation and then you look at it as a whole then.
Okay, so when you say restore by the end of the 24-week or whatever cover period you've chosen, you mean restore the average?
Right.
Okay.
So
And that brings up a good point too, because there's been some confusion. And I've attended a seminar that actually contradicted. Originally, it said that if your policy is that someone's full-time for 35 hours, then their FTE is 1 if they stay to 35. But then if you read the literal interpretation, anybody less than 40, you have to do the mathematical calculation and you don't have a whole 1. So that's been another area that we would love a FAQ on, and we just haven't received it. So if we're going to have anyone that's right on the fence and they need the terms to go in their favor, we might just have to wait until we get some clarification or see how even the bank has been told to interpret it, because the bank's ultimately the one that puts it through the SBA and says, hey, this is forgiven, or part of it's not.
So it's okay.
30 hours is not a full-time employee then.
What 30, anything less than 40?
Right.
Yeah, if you read what the SBA says, it says in this case, an FTE 1 is 40.
Okay.
Yeah. And then you talk to SBA too, and they're agreeing with that. So again, there are some confusing points to this that I want to bring out, because very rarely are we left with something that we have some confusion on a couple points, and those 2 points are exactly something we just haven't received definite guidance on.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, I work for an organization and the full-time employees are considered to work a 35-hour week. So would they not be counted as 1?
Well, I can tell you from the additional seminars we've attended, their position is yes, that if it was always your policy and you're not changing it and you could prove documentation, then yes. If we go to the literal interpretation of the guidance we've received from SBA, they're saying anything less than a 40 is not a whole 1. Now, I do not believe in playing, the audit roulette whatsoever, but I can tell you that there is a checkbox on the application that if you receive a greater than $2 million loan, you check it. SBA has indicated that those loans will be audited. Otherwise, the other loans they've indicated will not be audited. So if there are a few items of interpretation, we're of course going to go with the best professional guidance we can on what the professionals seem to all collectively believe together and apply it. And that is one area, Stacy, that question you asked, that is one area that we would argue that 35 hours is your one FTE. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
And this is a huge, I knew this was going to spark some questions because you guys are right. This is an area that's still left with a little bit of confusion. And that's why I can't stress enough that if you can restore by December 31st, you're going to qualify to use the EZ, and you're not going to have to supply nearly the documentation that you would have to otherwise. Now, there's also another exemption too. If there's an inability to hire similarly qualified employees before 12/31, this is big, and I'm starting to see this. And the reason why I'm starting to see it is because the labor market is tight right now, and it's still very competitive. So let's say you had someone that resigned. Again, the exemption says that you got their voluntary resignation, and that's okay. But if it was for any other reason and you couldn't, you have the inability to hire because the market just won't allow for it, then you also don't have to take a ding for that FTE also. So they really have tried to help businesses and nonprofits to really obtain 100% forgiveness. And then there's another condition too, again, trying to help out. Oh yes, sorry.
Let me ask another question. Full-time employee on unpaid medical leave, I assume that would be exempt from the pay decrease, is that correct?
Unpaid, yeah, the unpaid medical leave is actually a different program that the IRS allowed. It was a 10-day program. So yes, that is a carve out for that.
And then there's a final one. If on the application you listed the number of employees you had, as it didn't ask for FTE employees, as that would have been a different number, how do you fix that in the forgiveness application if the wrong number was made on the application?
Oh, if the wrong number was used on the original?
Yeah, because they didn't ask for FTEs on the original. They just asked for the number of employees.
Number of employees. Huh. Yeah, because, that's a good question. I don't even know if there's an ability to do that, or if it's just going to require some documentation, to prove it, is what I believe. Yeah, because I don't think there's a way you can go back and amend an application, nor would that be subject to having to do that.
Yeah, I think the documentation is the key. Document what you had when you applied and what you called the total number of employees. Document what you've got when you finish.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's going to be a lot of documenting. So in all these exemptions I was telling you about, it's all going to come down to documentation. If you fired for cause, document it. Just because they get unemployment doesn't necessarily mean you didn't fire them for cause. We are an at-will state, and often an employee will get unemployment regardless if you fired them for cause. So you're going to want to document that. If they voluntarily resigned, you need the resignation letter in writing. And if you gave them a written offer to return to employment and they turned it down, all that needs to be in writing. So yes, what Paul is saying, you're just gonna have to document any kind of variances whatsoever that help your case. So then there's also an inability to return to the same level of business activity that occurred before 2/15. So most of us were operating in normal activity as of 2/15, right? I mean, we kind of just maybe started hearing about this. We didn't really know what it was, and especially due to a government mandate. And our governor was very quick, to declare state of emergency. We had a federal emergency declared that we would fall under. So let me just give you an example. It would be a hair salon that wasn't permitted by the state to offer nail services. And so therefore the borrower would not have to reduce their forgiveness under these circumstances because they could not return to the same level of business activity. This one is huge. I mean, how many borrowers can argue that they're not at the same level of business activity? I mean, what nonprofit couldn't argue that, right? I mean, you could prove it right in your decline of your revenue, your cancellation of events. So again, this goes to one of those issues where We haven't been given much like examples on this, other than the obvious, like I stated, tattoo salon that could not be open. They were mandated to close. Okay, that's pretty black and white, right? But where the gray issue is someone who, a nonprofit that stayed open during the whole time, but you were not operating at your same business level activity. So again, this is going to be a level of documentation you're going to have to keep. And you don't have to make this argument if you didn't drop in FTEs and 25% salary. So again, all these arguments that I'm talking about and documenting, you won't have to do if you restore everything by the covered period or December 31st. This is only going to be an issue is if you have a reduction, and we're trying to fight to make sure you don't have a reduction of your forgiveness.
There's another quick question, Tammy. The application asks for staffing and payroll from the prior year. So those numbers should not apply if the look back is January and February, correct?
Right.
That means January and February 2020 for FT.
Right, correct, yeah. Yeah, and there's a big difference in the documentation that you have to supply if you're using the EZ versus the full application. If you're using the EZ, you literally complete the front and you have a Schedule A, and then on the application it tells you some documents that you have to include. It is substantially less in scope than if you don't qualify for the 3508 EZ. Okay, any other questions before we move on?
Just keeping an eye on time, we got about 20 minutes left.
Okay, well then let's jump into the actual process. Most borrowers are going to use Form 3508EZ, and you can use this if one of the three following conditions apply. One is you don't have any employees, so we're not even going to talk about that because nobody has that. So the other two are, and again, you only have to meet one. You did not reduce wages and salaries by more than 25% during the covered period or an alternative covered period. And that, I'm not even going to really go into the alternative much because it's for administration purposes only. If, for example, if your loan, you received it on April 20th, but your first payroll date was April 26th, you can actually start your covered period on April 26th instead of April 20th. That's all that means. There's a big, huge paragraph explaining that, but in short, that's all that means. And so you have to make sure that you didn't drop your wages by more than 25% compared to the period of January 1 to March 31st. And so this is a loaded condition. You did not reduce the number of employees between January 1st and the end of the covered period. So again, we have until December 31st. And this condition applies to the 25% reduction we've already talked about and the drop in FTEs. So this is nothing new. So as long as we have not dropped in either of those cases, we could do the EZ. And then the other condition is you didn't reduce your wages or salaries by more than 25%. So here's what it just comes to quick and easy. You can use the EZ form, the 3508 EZ, if you have not dropped more than 25% or FTE in your covered period or by December 31st. So if you have right now, wait it out, crunch some numbers, do a plan, look at the exemptions and see if you can meet this. And if you can, then it might be in your best interest to go ahead and apply for forgiveness. So again, that terminology to understand is covered period. Covered period starts from the date you received your funds. Received your funds, not applied, received your funds, or you can use the alternative cover period, which was just your first payroll. So now let's go to the actual application itself, and it is literally one page. This is it.
Quick question, Tammy. We lost 2 staff before COVID and before the covered period. So January 1st, we had more staff than we did when we applied, but not because of COVID. Does this preclude me from using the EZ form?
Did they resign or fired for cause?
Rachel, unmute.
Resigned.
Yeah, then you have your letter of resignation. You don't even have to disclose it, and you don't have to count that as a change in your FTE at all.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So the application's one page. There are certain attestations you have to make on page 2. There's some descriptions of terminology, and then on the, I think close to the last page, it says what you may have to submit, like a Form 941, which you're going to do anyways, and also some payroll records. Again, keep it simple. If you meet the requirement on payroll solely, do not worry about retirement, health, SUDA, rent, utilities. Don't even worry about it. Just keep it really simple. So you're going to have to put your loan number on the application, how much you received in the PPP, and your EIDL grant you received. So the EIDL was a SBA program also, and they were giving a $1,000 grant per employee. This is a reduction of PPP forgiveness. That's what that means on that application.
Another quick question, Tammy.
Yes.
If you use the alternative covered period for payroll, do you include the very next payroll that you have after the 56 days are up?
Yep, that's the nice thing about that alternative. As long as you paid those wages by the next payroll cycle after your covered period, you can use that.
Thank you.
Yep. Now, we don't anticipate many people are going to need to use the alternative covered period because you now have 24 weeks. So again, we're hoping to keep it simple, but it's there just in case. So then you can, on the application, you can list your covered period or your alternative covered period, and then you start diving into the forgiveness calculation. The first line 1 is 60% you have to meet in payroll costs, 40% line 2. Again, if you meet it in line 1, and I know that the feeling is going to be, wow, I don't like to leave all these blanks on the form. I feel like I got to fill in something. But again, your time and your staff's time is very precious with this, and you're going to have to include all this documentation with it too. Just stick to line 1, payroll costs. And if you can get to that number that exceeds your PPP loan amount, you're fine. You're fine with that. You've met that condition. So one other thing I wanted to go to, I did want to point out before we run out of time, and then if we have time, I'll pull the page from the application that what you're going to have to submit. So let's talk about that double dipping so I can make sure I get it in. Basically what this means is that you were reimbursed twice for the same, expense. And this can happen when you receive funding from different federal sources. Now, right now, we're interpreting PPP as being one of these. It may ultimately not be deemed as a federal funding source. So you might not really have a problem from the government side, but you may have a problem with some of your grants that you're applying for. They may list that as a condition and saying to disclose this to us, and you have to reduce the grant that you're applying for by the amount of the PPP. Now, again, this is only if your grant's language says that you're using the grant for wages, covered wage expense. So review your PPP amount compared to your other federal funding sources, or if any grants make this a condition, and consider some alternate options, such as maybe asking the grantor to extend your funding period, maybe asking them to reallocate what you're permitted to spend the funds are on, or the requirements of the funds. You definitely don't want to go with worst case, which is having to have some of that PPP deemed as a loan, because even though it's 5 years and it's favorable terms, a nonprofit's going to struggle as is. The last thing you have are the funds to pay back loan proceeds. So also consider this too. You have 24 weeks to meet the PPP requirement, but document when you met the requirement, because see, this could hurt you with grants, because you don't want to say, oh, I used the PPP and it was for all salaries through December 31st. You may not have needed the PPP till December 31st. Maybe you got the PPP on May 1, and maybe you've used all of your PPP by June 30th. If you've used it all by June 30th, you make sure you document that And that way, when you apply for funds with the grant, you can start using the grant for salaries on July 1st. So we have to really make sure we understand the grant restrictions, and making sure that just because the covered period is 24 weeks or ends on December 31st, that we're not hurting ourselves by limiting our ability to get a grant to cover payroll for the rest of the year, the rest of the calendar year. Any questions on that? So I think there's some good workarounds on that.
So here's two more questions came in. The application for forgiveness says wages and allowable expenses paid or incurred in the period. Does that mean either? Or can you have prepaid expenses before your loan was received for wages paid after the loan received, but for dates of work prior to the loan received?
Good question. I'll give you some solid examples on what that means. So it's not necessarily prepaid. Think of it as accrual. So it's more of, I have wages through June 30, and maybe my period ends June 30, but I don't pay my wages until July 5th. That's permitted because you actually incurred them but didn't pay them. Here's an example too of a utility bill. Maybe my covered period ends June 30th, but I paid for my electric on July 5th. Again, it wasn't paid, but it was incurred. So it's not a prepaid, but it's just a bill that truly did fall within that covered period. You just didn't technically pay it until the next bill cycle or payroll cycle. That's what that means.
So here's a follow-up. We have a bus salary covered by DART. So I tracked those hours differently to show I was reimbursed by DART for the portion that is not included in my PPP wages. So that would be okay to show I didn't double dip, right?
So those are wages that are paid by the nonprofit but are ultimately reimbursed by another entity.
Yep.
So yeah, that could be considered double dipping because you were reimbursed for those. You in fact didn't incur those. So again, that goes based on if 100% of those wages are reimbursed by that grant, that is exactly the definition of double dipping. It's federal sources, and that could be an issue in that case.
So just to add on that, because that was my question. So the bus driver would work certain hours on the bus, but then he worked other hours at the center. So I split that out to show that, because I have to report to DART as bus wages. So I report that to DART, and then the other part I charge to the PPP.
Absolutely. Thank you for, yeah, you're right. Yep. And just document, and it sounds like you have that anyways. Yep. All right. Paul, how are we on time?
Got another 7 minutes.
All right. Good thing I talk fast. Okay. So here's one last thing I wanted to go over with you guys is the checklist for using the 3508 EZ. So of course, we already talked about the wages, and you have to attest that you didn't have more than a 25% drop or the FTE count. So if you can check that, you're okay. Then also too, your lender is going to ask you for several documents. So this is on the application too. It says documents that each borrower must maintain, but is not required to submit. Now, I do recommend you build your file for this just in case your PPP was subject to audit. But right now, we've been told that the SBA does not have enough manpower to audit any of these forgiveness applications below $2 million. And also your lending institution, they are already scrambling on how they are going to be able to facilitate all these loan forgivenesses. They're hiring national companies to handle this forgiveness for them. So you're not going to have, your local representative that you have from your institution. So you're going to have to probably follow a link on a portal, and you're going to have to submit documents electronically, and some you're going to have to submit, and some you're just going to have in your file. So you're going to have to document that your salary and your hourly pay was not reduced by 25% during, of course, this covered period and between then January 1st and March 31st. And you have to include all payroll records that list each employee separately. I think somebody brought maybe that up too. And then you have to show the amounts paid to each employee during the period of January 1 and March 31st, 2020. Then you have to have regarding any job offers and refusals. So we already kind of went over that. Documentation, have it in your file. And then you have to have documentation that you did not reduce the number of FTEs paid between January 1st and the end of the covered period or December 31st. Then you have to have documentation that you were unable to operate between February 15th and the end of the covered period at the same level of business activity. So again, start building that documentation in your file if you believe you're going to need it. Start building that now. You're also going to have your most recent prepared 941, which right now, for a lot of people, it won't even be the Q2 one. It might be your Q3 or your Q4 form that could come into play. And then you're also going to have to keep payroll, I call them payroll summaries of some sort. Like if you have ADP, Paychecks, payroll provider, they've built into their system PPP reports that you can run for your covered period. So yes, you have to have a 941, but you also have to have payroll reports for your covered period to prove the level of payroll did not drop. And this should be per employee. So keep all these records in total and then also per employee when you're doing those summaries.
Tammy, where can they get a copy of the checklist?
That checklist is part of the 3508EZ application. That was part of that link. So that Treasury link has everything. It has stats, the application, has everything with it. And if we were to get some FAQs, the Treasury would post those too. So if you go on there, they have a nice summary and they date everything. So you can skip the postings that were from like May, early June. I only search now for July postings and updates.
So here's that link again for everyone.
Can I ask a question, please?
Sure.
Just for clarification, because I've heard it two different ways in two different webinars. If we were to have, when we got our loan, it was on May 8th.
Okay.
We had a payroll on May 15th that the work dates were through May 7th. So that was before the date of our loan was received. In two different seminars, I heard it two different ways that you could either count that payroll or not count that payroll for the loan period. And I just wanted clarification on that.
You can actually count that if you want to adopt the alternative covered period, because that's when you paid it. You paid it after the date that you received the loan, and that is permitted under the alternative covered period. That is a checkbox though on the application, and you do have to put the dates of that period down.
Okay, because I thought we couldn't start our period until at least until the date of when we actually received the loan funds, which was May 8th. But that's the beginning of our next pay period. Also, our bill period would be that May 8th. So I didn't think that we had an alternative period at that point.
Because it says for administrative convenience, borrowers with a bi-weekly payroll schedule, so you couldn't do this if you're weekly, bi-weekly, using the 24 week, because you received your loan before June 5th, can begin on the first day of their first pay period following their PPP loan disbursement date.
Which that is the same date. Okay, we got our loan on the 8th, and that's the first day of our next payroll period, okay? But because our payroll ended, dates of service anyway, our actual work dates ended on May 7th, we didn't pay those wages until May 15th.
Okay, but your payroll, Yeah, tell me your payroll period again. The first day was the 8th.
The first day of our new payroll would have been May 8th, and that is also the day we got our loan. So they coincide.
Yeah, I see what you mean in that case. Yeah, because if you read it literally, it does say that begins on the first day of their first pay period following their PPP loan disbursement date. So you're right on the day.
Yes.
Oh,
So
yeah, you know, you could read that 2 ways. If you could read it as first day of the payroll period, okay, May 8th, or you can say, well, it clearly says the first pay period following the PPP loan disbursement date. In that case, my interpretation would be the latter. Yeah, and
my question is can you include wages that were earned prior to receiving the loan if they were paid after the loan was received? And I've received information both directions on that you can make an argument, because in that application for forgiveness, it says you either incurred it or you've paid it. So we would be paying it within the time frame, but we would not have incurred it during the time frame.
Yeah, that was old language, and I definitely know what you're saying with that. I would apply more of this new language first. So then I think you're left with one of 2 decisions. And here's probably how I would approach it. I would look at my calculation and see, first, do I need it? And if I don't, then I would just apply conservatively and go with the covered period. If you do need it, personally, I think you have an argument for saying that you could include that one because of this language that leaves it open.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So sorry, I can't give you a 100% advice. That's my interpretation of it. But if you don't need it, that's the best scenario.
Any other final questions before we finish? I don't see any. Thank you so much, Tammy. Thank you for everyone for your questions and for participating. Very helpful information. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
We will send out an evaluation of this. So if you would fill that out, it only takes about 4 minutes to complete. We want to make sure that we're offering things that are helpful. Thank you very much. Thanks, Tammy.
Thank you. Bye.